If you've watched any of my videos, you probably know I'm slightly obsessed with anything comic book related. Comic book characters, movies from comic books, video games from comic books, anything like that. I am absolutely obsessed with it, and it all started back when I was a kid. And more specifically, what started that addiction was Spawn, issue number 2. I distinctly remember going to the grocery store with my mom, finding this comic book and thinking, man, this character looks really cool, and it's number 2, so let's start reading it. I picked this up, or I should say my mom bought it for me, thank you, Mom, and I was instantly hooked. Now, I had read X-Men comics and other comics, but this is the comic that ended up getting me absolutely hooked on comic books and everything related to them. Now, to celebrate my love for this comic book in particular, and this is the actual comic book that I bought when I was 12 years old. It has a crease in the cover here from where I've read it so many times or just didn't handle it properly. But what I wanted to try was something really unique and special, and that's recreating this by 3D printing this comic book cover absolutely enormous. And to do that, we're gonna use a special software called Hueforge. Also, a huge, and I mean absolutely huge, special thank you to Todd McFarlane for creating this character and drawing and making so many amazing comic books and action figures and movies and video games and comic books related to this character here. I have been obsessed for my entire life. I got a job at a toy store just so I could get a discount on toys, more specifically those McFarlane action figures that he made. Now, I won't lie, the Hueforge app is a bit intimidating to use. However, once you've watched a few videos, they've got some really brief tutorial videos over on their YouTube page, as well as there's a bunch of other content creators making Hueforge videos that help further explain how to use the software. It has gotten so much easier for me to work with, and basically the entire concept of this is that you take an image, bring it into the software, it's gonna end up taking that image and creating a 3D variation of it using the luminosity of the image. And what you can end up doing is specifying how thick you want your image to be, and that at each individual layer height, you can specify colors. And then you're gonna stack color on top of color on top of color in thin layers. That's gonna allow you to create these really cool color transitions that you've probably seen other people create and post about. But before I can even get to 3D printing this, what I need to do is validate the colors that I'm gonna be using for the software. Now, to do this, Ajax 3D has created a tool called the TD1 that allows you to specifically insert your filament, and it's gonna detect exactly what the color code settings are for Hueforge. So as an example, I have this bright blue PLA from Elegoo, and what I'm gonna do is take that and insert it directly into the one side opening of the reader and slide it in, and it's gonna let me know that it's scanning, and then as I have it plugged into the application, it's gonna pop up that information directly on screen with the values for me to directly load this filament into Hueforge. So now what I've done is taken all of my different filament colors that I think I'm potentially gonna use for this project and scanned them using the TD1 to have those colors inserted into the library for me to use. This way I know exactly what the colors are gonna represent and work with directly in Hueforge when it comes to 3D printing these. Now, this is for sure not a Hueforge tutorial. I barely know what I'm doing, but I've gotten so much better with this as I've been plugging away at it, working with it, and just playing around with it. That is probably the biggest thing that I would recommend that you do, is just continue to play around with the software and give it a try, because you can mix and match so many different colors and create different variations of the images that you want to work with. Knowing that I wanted to print this on the Elegoo Orange Storm Giga, I was still limited to the build volume size of that 3D printer, which is 800 by 800 on the X and Y. Now, I wanted to actually print even larger than that for this poster, which means I'm gonna need to split it in half. Now, I could just cut it right down the middle, but I'm gonna end up with a nasty seam that's gonna be really hard for me to correct. So what I ended up doing is taking this directly into Photoshop, and I ended up following along some of the black creases and edges of the image to separate from the top to the bottom in a more organic fashion. This way, when I go and 3D print it, hopefully I'll be able to seamlessly hide that seam. See what I did there? And after I figured out exactly what my color combinations were and how many layers I needed of those colors for me to get a decent representation of this translated it into something that I could go in 3D print, I decided to export this out so that I could actually get it 3D printed. And what's really awesome about this software is that it's gonna also provide you with a text file that tells you exactly how you need to print this, at what layer height you need to have your pauses or color changes, and at what layer height you need to be printing this at. Since my image was split in half and had transparencies in it, I needed to bring this into Prusa Slicer, and I could trim off the very bottom of the STL file that was generated by Hueforge to remove any artifacts from the transparency exporting into an STL file. Then I could take that file and bring it directly into Orca Slicer and start plugging in all of those settings directly from that text file. This means I needed to adjust some of my print settings, as well as when I do the print preview, I can go in and right click at each specific layer height that's called out in the document and set my pauses for the 3D printer. And since the Orange Storm Giga doesn't support multicolor printing, what we're gonna end up doing is adding a pause command at each of the specified layer heights, which is an M800 command. Then it's just a matter of exporting that file, loading it up into the 3D printer, and getting this printed. Now this is gonna require a good number of color changes as well throughout this entire process of printing this. So it means I need to be actively keeping an eye on the 3D printer so that when it pauses, I can come back here and change it out into the other colors. And to make that a little bit easier on myself, I just used a Waze camera and monitored that from my phone and tried to pay attention to whenever there was a pause in the printer, I'd come back here and change out the filament. And our first print of our 3D printed poster is finished, and it looks so good. I am really excited about this project here. It says that this took just under 12 hours to print here on the Orange Storm Giga. In reality, it was a good bit longer for this to print because of all the delays and me changing the colors of filament and not being here for that. So that's one disadvantage of not having a multicolor system, but obviously having a huge 3D printer like this has its own benefits. I'm even loving the bottom corner of this print where it initially didn't adhere to the print bed and caused it to lift ever so slightly, but it's kind of curled on the edges and it makes it look even more like a comic book. And one of the trickiest parts about this is trying to get it off the bed without warping. Now, I probably could have been a little bit more careful with the removal of the print from the bed, but this is really friggin' cool. This is massive. I was not anticipating, actually, I was anticipating how big this was gonna be, but it's once you get it in your hands, it's a completely different story. This is also exceptionally thin. So I knew it was gonna be thin, but this scale, it is definitely really thin and flimsy, so I might have to try and find a way to properly back this. Also, there's a little bit of stringing here on the top of the print. I'm not too worried about that. We'll get that cleaned up. In the meantime, let's start up the top half of this print. This is also a great time for me to say a big thank you to Elegoo for sponsoring today's video. They are the makers of that enormous 3D printer, the Orange Storm Giga. But they also make some other 3D printers that aren't necessarily that large, like the Neptune 4 Plus, and the Neptune 4 Max. And they also make some amazing and affordable filament that I used for this project. If you're interested in more information about any of Elegoo's products, you'll find links to those down below. And the top half of the print is finished. This took just under 19 hours of print time, a little bit longer with the 8 different color filament changes, and you can even see some of the transitions between the colors on this upper half of the poster. And if I take the bottom half and align it with the top, you get a better idea of how this is gonna actually all assemble together. And unlike the bottom half where I just kind of yanked it off of the print bed ever so carefully, I wanna really be careful with these mouse ears on the bottom half of this upper poster, because I wanna try and reuse those as backings for the connection points for the two prints. But take a look at how big and awesome this 3D print is. It's so incredibly thin as well. What's really amazing about this entire Hueforge print process is you'll get some crazy results with these, but it doesn't really use a whole heck of a lot of filament. This whole entire thing barely used any of the spools that I had for all the different color transitions. The biggest was easily, or the most that I used was ended up being that black filament for the bottom base layers. But even that is coming in so thin as it is, it really didn't use up all that much filament. I probably shouldn't do that. And those small circles that you see on some of the edges of the prints, that's called mouse ears. That's a type of bed adhesion option that's within Orca Slicer. You can do those in other slicers just by adding a really thin circular object to the corners, but this helped keep down all of those little sharp angles there from lifting off the bed during the print process. They're also really easy to just kind of break free from the print. All right, so again, here's the plan. I've got the 2 halves of our 3D printed poster. I've removed the mouse ears from the bottom half because what I wanna do is, because those mouse ears are nice and flat on the bottom side and this upper half is already extruded upwards slightly, I'm gonna put a little bit of 3D gloop on the little circles here and then try to use that as a contact point for the bottom half of the poster here, because there's not a whole lot of area, of surface area for these 2 parts to connect together. Now, unfortunately, the connection isn't super strong because of the mouse ears, so I flipped this over, applied a little bit more 3D gloop to any areas that needed it, and now I'm gonna use a 3D printing pen to fill in any of the gaps here to help secure these more together. And you'll notice I'm going pretty thick with this as well. This will help really cover up any open gaps that there might be between the 2 panels. I think that came out pretty good. Yeah, that looks really good. I'm not seeing any of that filament from the filament pen coming through or seeping through on the other edges. It's certainly a little bit more raised, but I don't think you could really tell just by glancing at this. Now, because this is so thin, I do want to add some backing to it to make it a little bit thicker. So what I'm going to end up using is some of this marker board that you can pick up at most hardware stores. This was like, I don't know, $8 for this huge sheet. So what I'm going to do is cut this to size, actually slightly undersized, so that we won't see it anywhere, and then get it mounted to the back of our poster. I did not expect to be setting off the fire alarm by cutting that. Was there a better tool for that job? Probably, but I don't really care. It got it done. Now let's just double check the cutting to make sure that it's small. Yep, it is. Perfect. Nice. I've got about a ½ an inch all around, and most importantly, it's not gonna be shown from the bottom where it was curling up. Now it's time to break out the barge cement and get these 2 pieces merged together. Now, if you've never used this stuff before, you need to apply it and let it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes before pressing the 2 parts together, and it should create a really nice weld. And now that I've got it connected to something solid, it's gonna be a lot easier for me to clean up all of the stringing with either a heat gun or a blowtorch. And the very last step in all of this is actually getting it hung up. And to do that, I'm just gonna apply some command strips to the back of this and get it secured on the wall. That's perfect. This spot, I thought this might work out well. It's right next to the Giga, so every time I'm printing, I'll be able to see it. Every time I'm recording a video, I'm facing this way, so I'll be able to see this as well. This project was so much fun, and this was so exciting for me to recreate something that I'm so passionate about and enthusiastic about from my childhood. This is, again, what got me into comic books. Specifically, this issue is what really sold me on Spawn and Image and so many other comic books along the way. And, you know, I would have never imagined in a million years being able to recreate something like this myself from that initial issue. Now, what I didn't tell you is that I went and tested this initially here, much smaller. This is almost official comic book size. This took 3 hours, and I just wanted to test out the colors and see how well this would blend together and if I had everything the way that I was envisioning it. And I'm so happy that I took this and then even blew it up larger. And you can even see here where some of the colors, because this is so small and compact, how the colors vary from how they actually printed at a much larger size. And linked below is a giveaway that I have for the Ajax 3D TD1 that I ended up using in this video here. So if you're interested in finding out your specific color values for the filaments that you own when it comes to doing these Hueforge prints, you can enter that giveaway down below. And obviously, if you're interested in creating your own Hueforge print yourself, I'll have links to that down below. And again, it's a really affordable software coming in at just a one-time fee of $24. Now, I also wanted to say a big thank you to all my Patreon supporters for your continued support of me making content like this here on the interwebs. If you're interested in the 3D printer settings that I used for this project, you can find those over in my Patreon, along with a bunch of other settings that I use for my 3D printers. And obviously, if you have any other comic book cover suggestions that I should try and print, let me know in the comments down below. Hey, thanks so much for watching, you all, and I'll see you next time. Bye now. I also want to say a big thank you to my mom for not only taking me to the grocery store and buying this comic book for me, but also encouraging me to read comic books and buying me all sorts of other comic books that I was interested in. Mom, love you so much.